cover that thing. Should always cover like the brand name stuff that shows up on, you know, the background. So it's not like I'm not sponsored. Pretty sure that's everything. Can't ever be too sure sometimes. Okay, I'm just gonna readjust the lighting a bit. I'm like, it's too bright or something? I don't know. Maybe my seating positioning's bad, or maybe not enough blue light. I don't know. Just gotta make sure the lighting is good though. Just give it a minute or so before we actually start. It's been a long day though. Gotta stretch. Oh, I did a little bit of that before the stream too, so I don't know what's up with that. Maybe it's just me being old or something. Anyway, hello and welcome to the Streaming Parson Reads, the Book of Luke. Today we're going to cover 2 more chapters in the Gospel of Luke. We'll be reading chapter 8 and chapter 9. It's going to be a lot of content, so, you know, get some kind of notepad or whatever to keep notes and whatnot. I've never said that in any of the other streams. I don't know if I have. Maybe I have. I've been doing this for a while, right? So I don't know if I've said some things I may have already said. But I mean, it's something that, like, I don't know, with any kind of quote-unquote study, you know, it's like a disease word nowadays, but with any kind of study, you should always have some kind of note-taking. Appendagers to use. But with that said, we're going to start reading from I'll be reading from the New International Version. Use, like, I don't know, the Bible Gateway on your desktop or the Bible app. They're great tools to use. Free Bible. Why would you not use it? So I encourage you to do that. Flip to Luke 8, and I'll start us off with a quick word of prayer, and then we'll begin. Lord Jesus, we thank you for this day, and we thank you for this time that we have to read into your word. And I just pray that as we read your word today, you would show us more of who you are and your desire for our lives, and draw us closer to you ultimately. I pray this in your holy name. Amen. All right, so we're already like almost 10 chapters in the book of Luke, and this is one of those parts where the Bible will kind of go back and forth between, like, here's a couple things Jesus does, and then Jesus says a bunch of stuff, and then he'll do a couple more things, and then he says a bunch of stuff. And of course, this is this was extremely important to the early church because, the very basis of Christianity was to emulate the life of Jesus. And so they wanted to pay close attention to the way he lived as well as the stuff he said, so that, the Christians would be able to follow what Jesus told them to do and how to be the people that would change entire nations, lead people to Jesus and all that. And so there's going to be quite a bit of that for the next few weeks. I mean, I would dare say a month at least, as we go back and forth between, Jesus' adventures and some teachings of Jesus. So last week, we had covered this kind of theme of Jesus as the Messiah, labeling himself as the Son of Man, going around and breaking kind of social taboos to kind of illustrate that God's gospel, if you will, reaches beyond just those in the know of the religious world, I guess is the best way of wording it. And so Jesus has the famous saying, I've come to bring sinners to repentance, just as a doctor is to heal the sick. I know it's not the exact wording he uses, but that's kind of the idea. And so Jesus would hang around tax collectors, people viewed as traitors to the Jewish nation. Jesus would associate himself with people of lower social class, as well as people with kind of, questionable past. And the idea was, Jesus is bringing forgiveness, God's forgiveness to all people, regardless of who they are, which is one of the centerpieces of what Christianity is all about. It doesn't matter who any of us are, we can all come to faith and be forgiven by Jesus Christ. So that's kind of where we left off. And of course, we had the last story of Jesus visiting a teacher of the law. And there's a questionable woman, and Jesus brings this interesting illustration of talking about, the how we ought to respond, I guess, to God's forgiveness to us. And one of the biggest dangers that the religious elites had was that since they viewed themselves as being so perfect, they didn't view themselves as forgiven by God. And since they're not, quote unquote, forgiven by God, then there was no real, I guess you could say, no real need to make themselves better people. If that makes sense. There was no reason for them to be better people. And so that was something that was a stark contrast to how the Jewish religious elites were living versus what Jesus had come to do. Okay, now that I changed the monitor setting, there you go. We'll see how this is. I always have to mess around with the lighting thing a bit. But anyway, we're going to start with chapter 8 and dive right into it because there's a lot of content. I mean, it's one of those things. One of the difficulties of doing a book study of the book of Luke is that, like, a lot of these like sets of passages, and in your typical Bible, your Bible will divide up various narration parts, if you will, whether Jesus is doing a miracle or he's teaching something or whatever. The most modern Bibles divide these up to like little story bits and whatnot. And every time it does, a lot of pastors will be quick to like use just that passage for like sermons and stuff like that. And that's, pretty parkour. I mean, I've done it myself, so it's not any, I'm not criticizing that in any sense of the word, But the thing I will get at is, since you could make multiple sermons on like a given piece of text, it's it's going to be a lot for us to do a thorough study through, if that makes sense. Because like I said, pastors have made like multiple sermons on like some even sections of each chapter that we read, and the Gospels are especially notorious for that. And I mean, why would they not be? These are, as I mentioned before, the teachings of Jesus would have been something that the Christians closely paid attention to, more than most other parts of the Bible, for obvious reasons. With that being said, there's so much detail that can be extrapolated, and we'll do a fair amount of that. But like I said, I'm not gonna like overdo it, because like I said, I could probably spend an entire stream on like chapter 8 alone. I probably could, but I'm not going to. After all, we're gonna try and finish the book. We're gonna try and do three. At this rate, we'd be lucky we get 3 books of the Bible done in this year. But I mean, we'll see how this goes down, right? Anyway, chapter 8, verse 1. Now after this, Jesus traveled about from one town and village to another, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom of God, and the 12 were with him. And also some women who had been cured of evil spirits and diseases, a Mary called Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had come out, Joanna, the wife of Chuza, the manager of Herod's household, Susanna, and many others. These women were helping to support them out of their own means. Now while a large crowd was gathering and people were coming to Jesus from town after town, he told this parable. A farmer went out to sow his seed, and as he was scattering the seed, some fell along the path. It was trampled on, and the birds ate it up. Some fell on rocky ground, and when it came up, the plants withered because they had no moisture. Other seed fell among the thorns, which grew up with it and choked the plants. Still, some seed fell on good soil. It came up and yielded crop, 100 times more than was sown. When Jesus said this, he called out, "Whoever has ears to hear, let them hear." His disciples asked him what the parable meant. And Jesus said, "The knowledge of the secret of the kingdom of God has been given to you, but to others I speak in parables, so that though seeing they may not see, and though hearing they may not understand." This is the meaning of the parable. The seed is the word of God. Those along the path are the ones who hear, and then the devil comes along and takes the word away from their hearts, so that they may not believe and be saved. Those on the rocky ground are the ones who receive the word with joy when they hear it, but they have no root. They believe for a while, but in times of testing they fall away. The seed that fell among the thorns stand for those who hear, but as they go on their way, they are choked by life's worries, riches, and pleasures, and they do not mature. But the seed on good soil stands for those with a noble and good heart, who hear the word, retain it, and by persevering, produce a crop. So no one lights a lamp and hides it in a clay jar or puts it under a bed. Instead, they put it on a stand, so that those who come in can see the light. For there is nothing hidden that will not be disclosed, and nothing concealed that will not be known or brought out into the open. Therefore, consider carefully how you listen. Whoever has will be given more. Whoever does not have, even what they think they have, will be taken from them. Now, Jesus' mother and brothers came to see him, but they were not able to get near him because of the crowd. And someone told him, "Your mother and brothers are here, and are standing outside wanting to see you." And Jesus replied, My mother and brothers are those who hear God's word and put it into practice. One day, Jesus said to his disciples, "Let's go over to the other side of the lake." So they got into a boat and they set out. As they sailed, he fell asleep. A squall came down on the lake, so that the boat was being swamped and they were in great danger. The disciples went and woke him, saying, "Master, Master, we're going to drown." Jesus got up and rebuked the wind and the raging waters. He got up and rebuked the wind and the raging waters. The storm subsided, and all was calm. "Where is your faith?" he asked. In fear and amazement, the disciples asked one another, "Who is this? He commands even the winds and the water, and they obey him." So they sailed to the region of Gerasenes, the Gerasenes. That's how you actually say it. The Gerasenes. Sorry, the thing was like caught up, so I had to like read ahead there. The Gerasenes, which is across the lake from Galilee. When Jesus stepped ashore, he was met by a demon-possessed man from the town. For a long time, this man had not worn clothes or lived in a house, but he lived in the tombs. And when he saw Jesus, he cried out and fell at his feet, shouting at the top of his voice, "What do you want with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High? I beg of you, don't torture me." For Jesus had commanded the impure spirit to come out of the man. Many times it had seized him, and though he was chained hand and foot and kept under guard, he had broken his chains and had been driven by the demon into solitary places. Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" "Legion," he replied, because many demons had gone into him, and they begged Jesus repeatedly not to order them to go into the abyss. A large herd of pigs was feeding there on the hillside, and the demons begged Jesus to let them go into the pigs, and Jesus gave them permission. When the demons came out of the man, they went into the pigs, and the herd rushed down the steep bank into the lake and drowned. When those tending the pigs saw what had happened, they ran off and reported this in the town and countryside, and the people went out to see what had happened. When they came to Jesus, they found the man from whom the demons had gone out, sitting at Jesus' feet, dressed and in his right mind. And they were afraid. Those who had seen it told the people how the demon-possessed man had been cured. Then all the people of the region of the Gerasenes asked Jesus to leave them, because they were overcome with great fear. So Jesus got into the boat and left. Now the man from whom the demons had gone out begged to go with him. But Jesus sent him away, saying, "Go home and tell how much God has done for you." So the man went away and told all over the town how much Jesus had done for him. Now, when Jesus returned, a crowd welcomed him, for they were all expecting him. Then a man named Jairus, a synagogue leader, came and fell at Jesus' feet, pleading with him to come to his house, because his only daughter, a girl about 12, was dying. As Jesus was on the way, the crowds almost crushed him. And a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. Sorry, I lost my spot there. But no one could heal her. She had come up behind him and touched the edge of his cloak, and immediately her bleeding stopped. "Who touched me?" Jesus asked. When they all denied it, Peter said, Master, the people are crowding and pressing all over you. Sorry, that wasn't the voice I gave Peter originally, but that's his voice now. But Jesus said, Someone touched me. I know that power has gone out from me. When the woman, seeing that she could not go unnoticed, came trembling and fell at his feet in the presence of all the people, she told him why she had touched him and how she had been healed instantly. Then Jesus said to her, Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace. And while Jesus was still speaking, someone came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue leader. Your daughter is dead, he said. Don't bother the teacher anymore. Hearing this, Jesus said to Jairus, Don't be afraid. Just believe, and she will be healed. When Jesus arrived at the house of Jairus, he did not let anyone go in with him except for Peter, John, and James, and the child's father and mother, of course. Now meanwhile, all the people were wailing and mourning for her. Stop wailing, Jesus said. She's not dead, but asleep. The people laughed at him, knowing that she was dead, but he took her by the hand and said, Child, get up. Her spirit returned, and at once she stood. Then Jesus told them to give her something to eat. Her parents were astonished, but he ordered them not to tell anyone what had happened. Alright, boy howdy. Chapter 8. A lot of stuff there. So we're going to break it down into like 6 sections, because there's that many different parts here. At least 6 sections, but we're only going to talk about 6 of them. So I'm just going to do the first little intro here, where it talks about how, at this point in time, now the book of Luke doesn't care about timelines exactly, so we don't know how far along Jesus' ministry this is. All we do know is that at after some time, let's say a year, there was a lot of traction, and Jesus was gaining all this popularity, and he had a lot of other followers, and it's all those funny things where I know we focus on like the 12 apostles, but Jesus had a lot, and I mean a lot of other followers, and one of the interesting thing is that the book of Luke decides to include that a lot of these were women, and so we have Mary Magdalene, a popular character, I guess you could say, and there's been all those interesting theories about like maybe Jesus married Mary Magdalene and stuff like that. There's a lot of popular fan theories about stuff like that. But basically we have Mary Magdalene as being a huge fan of Jesus and one of the major followers. And, I could see why people would come up with the theory that her and Jesus were a lot more intimate, because she shows up quite a bit. She'll show up again in the book of Luke. I'm pretty sure she's like one of the only characters that actually appears across all the Gospels, except for maybe the book of Mark. I think the book of Mark kind of omits her, because the book of Mark, I guess the book of Mark didn't really talk about all the other people that were following Jesus around, but the book of Matthew definitely makes note of her. The book of John actually has she's actually more prominent in the book of John. And of course, as here in the book of Luke, Mary Magdalene shows up and has a few mentions, just like in Matthew. And so, Mary Magdalene's around quite a bit. Then we also have Joanna, the wife of some manager of Herod's household, which is actually kind of interesting because, one of the things that when Jesus showed up and people, thinking the Messiah is here, and of course a big part of the Messiah's role with that the Messiah would be the new king of Israel and Jerusalem, and a big part of that would be overthrowing, the worldly governments, or in this case the Roman government, right? And so Herod was like, how do I put it? Herod was like an acting king installed into office by the Romans. And so it's kind of interesting that the wife of someone who would work for the enemy, quote unquote, would be someone that was a major supporter of Jesus's ministry. And with her pretty high wealth, I mean, it's safe to assume she had a lot of wealth. I mean, her husband is like mega loaded. A lot of people theorize that Joanna here probably did a fair amount of. I mean, a lot of the other disciples. The Bible actually doesn't tell you this, but obviously the 12 financed Jesus' ministry quite a bit. And contrary to popular belief, not all of them were poor. Because, for example, sure, like a lot of them were fishermen. So Peter, Andrew, James, and John, they're fishermen. So they would have been like working class guys. They wouldn't have been super wealthy, but they're not super poor either. But then you have guys like Simon the Zealot. He probably would have been like on the poorer side. But on the other hand, some of Jesus's apostles would have been pretty wealthy. Levi / Matthew would have been one of them. And then maybe Nathaniel and Philip could have been a little bit on the wealthier side too, because they're sons of like teachers. So they could have been a little bit on the wealthier side. But of course, Jesus had support outside of the 12. And so with Joanna here and her husband's position, she probably had a fair amount of money that she could have used. Of course, unfortunately, because this is the ancient world, it's not like she could just like give tons of money to the ministry of Jesus, but she would have helped in whatever way she could. But she did have the resources, is what I was getting at. Well, the reason why she would not be able to give a lot of money, because being a woman, she wouldn't have that access. It's her husband's money technically, so there's that. But if she was supporting Jesus financially, that would have been interesting, that she would be using her husband's money, and her husband working for Herod of all people, someone who would have been very antagonistic to the idea of a Jewish Messiah showing up. But I think that's kind of interesting that Joanna is brought up here. Not like there's really anything else to say about her anyway. And of course, there were other women that were helping a lot of Jesus's ministry. Now, one of the things that the Bible does, which is kind of interesting, and I know there's like, this is where some people may think that either one, the Christians were very unashamed of being flat out, and being transparent about their belief system and how Christianity came about. Either that, or maybe, a lot of the popular view that a lot of people have is that, well, the Bible is totally like fabricated. Because you have, one of the funny things is, we read something like this, where we have these women that are prominent in Jesus's ministry, and we're helping out quite a bit. One of the things that's interesting is that in the ancient world, that's not how things would have been. You would not have women actually doing a lot of stuff like this because, the patriarchy. But in the ancient world, unfortunately, women were kind of viewed as second-class citizens, and so they would not have the power to do this kind of stuff extensively. Support, being financial support and stuff like that. Women would not have had that power in the ancient world, because that's unfortunately how it was back then. But for the Bible to point this out, there's those two options, right? Some people think, oh, well, either the Bible is probably fiction because this wouldn't happen in reality, especially in the ancient world. And you think of like a lot of even ancient stories don't use like, oh, women are being like powerful figures, because people wouldn't think that women were powerful figures. This is kind of how it was in the ancient world. But for the Bible to do this is kind of interesting, because either one, we go with the whole fiction thing, or two, it goes back to some of the other stuff we talked about in previous weeks when we were reading through the book of Luke, and how Jesus really breaks taboos. And so, Jesus is an equal opportunist, I guess you could say, in who he gets help from, because once again, if Jesus is just walking around doing ministry, he's not actually working. And so he would need support from wherever he could get it. And for women to volunteer their help would have been pretty interesting, that Jesus would accept their help. But of course, being God and all, and being a nice God, I guess you could say, in comparison to other pantheons and whatnot, Jesus isn't overly selective. And this goes back to, the Christian idea that, well, it doesn't matter who you are, we can all be believers in Jesus. Jesus isn't so selective like that. Things like your gender don't matter. And that's something you can also get from reading this little intro here in chapter 8. But that's all I really want to talk about with that part, because the next part, there's pastors have made sermon upon sermon on the next part, so we're going to talk about it. And that's this parable about the farmer who casts seeds, and Jesus equating the seeds to the word of God, and how people can treat the word of God. Which, case in point, right here, right? On the Streaming Parson channel. But anyway, so the parable goes pretty straightforward. Jesus equates the word of God and the message of the gospel, if you will, to a farmer's life. And so with the farmer life that Jesus uses to parallel ABC, Matt, etc. Only West Virginia wildlife. Hello, West Virginia, or I'll just call you Virginia from now on. Only Catholics are saved. The Bible is Catholic. Baptismal regeneration is taught in Acts 2:38. Confession in John 20:23. The Mass in Luke 22:19. Works in James. Papacy in Matt 16, 18, 19, etc. Then you have the whole thing with the Book of Romans, which, I get your point, but once again, faith in Jesus can be a lot more general as well. Now, I know that is probably the biggest objection to, oh, well, then the Protestant stance is too liberal. And I get that argument. But at the same time, there is merit to what you say, but at the same time, there is also people being saved through faith alone. Because what you're talking about are more, how do I put it, formalities in how church life should be, and I'm not opposed to those things. I'm not opposed to the formality of church life, not at all. But at the same time, that first statement, I don't know, that's a bold statement to say, well, only Catholics are saved. Because there's many a believer that are not at that formal level, that the Catholics practice. But I would say they're all saved as well. Because it's, once again, it's faith in Jesus Christ that is what leads us to be saved. But I'm not disagreeing with a lot of your points, though. I actually do agree with the baptismal regeneration is taught. I agree 100%. Confession, duh, obviously, that's I completely agree with that. Mass and Luke, yep, agree. Works and faith, don't remember, works and faith go together, as in James 2:24. I agree. And the papacy in Matthew, I agree. But the first part, when you opened up there, that part I don't agree. Because once again, all those who call in the name of Jesus, as taught in the book of Romans, are saved. And so even if you're not up to the Catholic level, if you will, using your illustration there, if you're not on that upper level of Christian life formality, those things are formalities of how we practice our spiritual life. But those things are not what make you saved. I just wanted to make that clear for anyone else that's watching, because I do agree that those things are important. They're all important, and I agree with all of those things actually. But at the same time, the thing that predicates all of those things and why, quote unquote, not only Catholics are saved, is that faith, you know, anyone can come to faith in Jesus, and then that is what saves you. And then the other stuff, well, those are all add-ons that we use to improve our spiritual life, but they do not, those are not the markers of which we are saved. Because being saved and improving your spiritual life are totally different things. And so I am all for improving spiritual life. Why do you think this channel exists? But like at the same time, you know, being saved comes through faith in Jesus Christ alone. Which is also what we promote on this channel all the time, right? That's kind of what I do. And so anyway, thank you for your contribution though. Thanks for dropping by. And welcome to the stream. Anyway, so back to the parable here in Luke 8. Well, I shouldn't do that because I just realized the light reflects off the Bible, kind of funny. But anyway, the parable of the seed and Jesus equating the word of life to like this farm life. Now, of course, I know some people are quick to pick this apart and say like, oh, you know, farmers don't just throw seed on the ground or whatever. That's kind of really crappy farming mechanics and whatnot. Of course, on the one hand, when people make that criticism, a lot of people, like, obviously modern farming inventions didn't exist. Secondly, don't forget the type of farmers Jesus is talking to. Now, of course, there's, you know, it's one of those funny things too that we don't really think about. And once again, in today's world, farming is only done by quote unquote professional farmers. And so professional farmers know all the advanced tactics. They know all the advanced skills of agriculture. So you would never see any of this today, and that's true. This kind of this kind of lazy farming, I guess you could call it. You wouldn't see this in farming today, because farming today is all done by professional farmers who all know the advanced tactics of farming. But when Jesus uses this illustration, and the people he's talking to would have understood this, because I just noticed I had some frame skip, but hopefully the stream is going fine. Hopefully this, you know, you're not lagging too much, or I'm not lagging too much. Just refresh the page if you think there's a little bit of lag. I think it should be okay now. I just had like a couple like frames skip there. I just noticed on OBS. But anyway, I get distracted by stuff like that. Anyway, in the ancient world though, a lot of farming was just like, how do I put this? Everybody was a farmer to an extent, because everybody had to work the land, make sure there was food. You know, food, once again, unlike today, growing food is not a guaranteed thing. Ancient world was pretty crappy like that. You know, thank God for modern technology, right? We don't have to worry about stuff like that. But in the ancient world where food wasn't guaranteed, everybody to an extent was a farmer. And everybody had to do something in regards to agriculture. But not everybody was educated in agriculture. And not everybody that would do agriculture would have like really paid attention to the, once again, one, because people would not have known back then, and two, because everybody was doing farming to some extent. There is a complacency, and this is the problem of when everybody does the same job. Then some people get the lazy mindset, like, well, why should we all do the same job? Because if, let's say, I do a crappy job, then someone will take care of me anyway. And so there's kind of this complacency, and so people would just use like really low end farming tactics if everybody was farming, and then everybody would just go, well, we'll just wing it. And that's kind of how it was in the ancient world. It was like, well, food growth isn't guaranteed, so we're all just gonna wing it. And Jesus put this into account in this story, which it's important that I draw that distinction, because once again, I know a lot of people criticize this part of the Bible and talk about like, well, no one farms like that, especially in today's world. And you know, you're right. Nobody farms like that today, because you know, farming is an actual professional job now. as opposed to something everybody had to do to, you know, live. But in the story, you know, I bring that up because in the story, this weird primitive form of farming it's funny because Jesus uses that form of farming to talk about the word of God, and it gets his point across pretty well. And so Jesus talks about, what's it, the four, it was a 3 or 4, I think it's like, hang on, let me read this here. Okay, so in the parable itself, there's only 3 types. In the Matthew account, there's 4 types of soil, if you will, or 4 results, because one of them is not really a soil type. You'll kind of see what I mean. And in the book of Luke, there's only 3 possibilities of what happens to the seed when the farmer casts the seeds, as Jesus tells the story. And so the first way is where, like, birds, like the seed is pretty exposed, and so the birds just come down and they eat it. And Jesus equates this to, well, the devil snatches it up, right? He snatches the word of God from people. You know, tempts people. Another way you could look at that is like, you know, he tempts people into going into a lifestyle that would be opposed to the gospel or whatever, something like that. It'd be kind of weird to think that, like, he can literally, like, the devil can literally siphon words out of people's ears. I mean, I guess I wouldn't rule out the possibility, but it is a little weird to think of that. But basically, the idea is that, you know, the devil tempts people away from godly living, and that's why people don't accept the word, etc., etc. And, you know, here's the bold statement, you know, hot take of the stream, if you will. You know, that's definitely true in today's culture. And there's so many distractions, if you will, out there, so many different ways for, you know, to push people away from, like, listening to the gospel and listening to, you know, people talk about Jesus. And I encounter this all the time. You know, and you talking to people about about the gospel or talk about Jesus, and some people are very quick to be like, "Oh, I don't want to talk about that. I don't want to talk about that." And it's like, not gonna give, you know, not gonna lend an ear for a few minutes. Like, I let you ramble on. You're not gonna let me ramble on, and then I've run into that from time to time. And, you know, there's some people that are pretty quick to turn away from the idea of, like, listening to the gospel and whatnot. And that's because one way you could put it is, you know, the devil's already put enough thoughts in their heads that they think they don't need to hear the gospel at all or whatever. And maybe the reason why the book of Luke doesn't include one of the second outcome in the book of Matthew, the one the book of Matthew uses, and that's where I think how the book of Matthew puts it is the seed will land on hot ground, and then the sun scorches up the seed, and then the seed dies. And maybe, you know, the bird thing and the sun thing, there's the same kind of idea is that, like, well, basically the seed is cast out, and then it just dies out there. Whether it gets eaten or burned up doesn't really matter. It just dies. And that, you know, that, like I said, that happens quite a bit. You know, people have a very, they're willfully deaf to the gospel. That's a way of putting it. They're willfully deaf to it. Which, I mean, I use that wording deliberately because, of course, you know, as we get to the end of the parable, Jesus does say, you know, those who can hear, let them hear. But there are people who are willfully deaf to listening to the gospel. And, you know, for whatever, there's all kinds of reasons why that might be the case. But the reality is there are people who are willfully deaf. And, you know, sure, what I do is just, you know, keep preaching the gospel over and over. Even if you want to be willfully deaf, well, I'm going to keep saying it anyway. Then you have the second group of people, which is, as Jesus describes it in the parable, seeds that are cast into thorns, and then the thorns also grow with the plant, or the wheat, I guess, or whatever you're growing. The weeds, the thorns grow with the plants, and then the thorns choke them out. And the idea that, you can't have these briar thorns also growing around. And then, this basic gardening, gardening knowledge. You have to make sure your plants don't have other plants feeding off the nutrients and taking up space. Kind of kind of obvious logic and common sense. And so Jesus has that parallel as well. And the parallel he talks about here is there are people who want to hear the gospel, but they're also choked up in everyday life. And this is where you get that thin line between the people who are willfully deaf and then people who allow the everyday life prevent them, if you will, from receiving the gospel. Of course, there's the little distinction, but once again, this is kind of a thin line between these two, is that with the first person, I guess you could say, the willfully deaf, if you will, they would use the other, like, oh, life is too busy or whatever, as excuses. But there's also a more, I guess, inner part of them that rejects the gospel. Whereas here, there may be people who would be receptive, but circumstances in life make it hard. And that can range from all kinds of things, from just being busy in life. And, we have this culture of being busy is important, and you're only useful as a human being if you're busy, which is dangerous, actually, as a mindset. But there's that. And then you have, just things in life that do take a lot of time. People who have a lot of financial struggles that they have to deal with, that is a real glaring problem. That can get in the way. Family life responsibilities, and family life is its own crazy thing. But of course, another thing that all Christians need to watch out for, and from the Christian side of it, is, we can't be like, we have to be trusting with God with those things. And so, yes, those things can be overbearing in a Christian's life as well. It's not just like, well, Christians have it easy, that's why they're able to listen to read the Bible, whatever, which is far from true. And so I know some people would use that as an excuse, like, oh, I'm too busy to, hear about Jesus or whatever. But you can, the thing is, we can always make time for stuff. And this is where, once again, I talked about this I think I talked about it last week, or did I talk about, no, I talked about this on the Monday podcast. I remember talking about this on the Monday podcast. And the whole everybody is religious shtick that I talked about. So it's not really I make the claim, it's more like I think people just need to be more accepting of this reality that everybody is religious, in the sense that we all devote our lives to something. And how that what your religion is, quote unquote, is the thing you make time for. And that's the thing that really and I didn't make this distinction on Monday's podcast, but I'll say it today. That's how that, X, whatever it is your religion, quote unquote. So before I expand on that further, I'm going to reiterate what I talked about on Monday. So on Monday, the Monday podcast, I think someone was I was going through an article that talked about things that non-Americans think is weird that Americans think is normal. And one of the things they said that they think is weird is how Americans pledge allegiance to the flag. The whole stand up, arm, right hand on your left chest, over your heart kind of thing, and you say the American anthem or whatever. And I pledge allegiance, da 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 da, right? And so the article I was taught going over on Monday's podcast, someone mentioned that that's weird to them. But what I pointed out, and why I disagree with that statement actually, was because I made the claim that every culture does something like that. And sure, we can make jokes of how belligerent Americans can be about being American, but every culture does their own version of it. And, there's nothing wrong with national pride in a vacuum. But at the same time, what the point I was getting at when I disagreed with that statement, that people think it's weird, that it's weird that Americans pledge allegiance to the flag. I'm like, no, every culture does something like that, because fundamentally we as people are all we all swear loyalty to something, and that can be all kinds of things. It can be all kinds of things, and it is that belligerence that we all have to that thing we devote our lives to. That is what makes us quote unquote religious. So we are all religious in that sense. Of course, the $64,000, the $1 million question would be, well, what are you religious to? I guess it's more than a $64,000 question, but the $1 million question would be, well, what are you religious to? And what I'm going to make the claim here on today's video is that a way you know what you're religious to is it's the thing you will make time for. Because we're all, everybody's busy more or less in their life. But there's always that thing you will make time for. Now, of course, in reality, we all have more than one thing we make time for. I'm not saying like, oh, every single person's a polytheist. Right? I'm a polytheist too. In that, by that logic, that's not what I'm getting at. But the things that are more important in your life, we will make time for it. And so going back with the whole, like, when people say like, oh, I'm too busy to like hear the gospel kind of thing. I mean, sometimes when people say that, that goes back to the more willfully deaf thing, as I mentioned with the first group of people. That's why like the first and the second groups that Jesus talks about here, they're kind of blurred together in my mind. Because if people try to use busyness as an excuse, it's not really a good excuse, because once again, you can make time for anything. I mean, I make time to read manga. Like, I will make time for that. I will be like, okay, I could be doing this or that, but no, I'm going to read manga because I love manga. I love reading manga. So I make time for it. Just like I make time in the morning to read my Bible, I also make time at night to read manga. It's not like I worship manga or anything like that, but what I'm getting at is, we as human beings, if there are things we actually care about, and for lack of better words, that we actually love, we will make time for it. And so that's why I go with the idea that if anyone tries to use that excuse of like, oh, I'm too busy, to hear you talk about Jesus kind of thing, it's like they're being willfully deaf. And so, which is really like one of the things that's, maybe this is me more on a philosophical level than a theological one, because now I sound like I'm contradicting the Bible. But I swear I'm not. At least I'm trying not to anyway. Borderlining blasphemy here. But there are only really two types of people, right? The people where the gospel takes root and people who don't. There's really only the two types and not the three, like in here, in the story. But the story, once again, Jesus uses three just for the metaphor to work. But on a philosophical level, really, there's only two kinds of people. The people that will make the time to listen to the gospel, and the people who won't. That's kind of what it comes down to. And those that do listen, well, eventually, at some point, the blessing will happen. The harvest Jesus talks about in this parable eventually happens at some point or another. And of course, one of the other things that we got to be careful of when we talk about that kind of thing is, the blessings and the harvest Jesus talks about does not equate to, like, for example, it's not like financial wealth. You'll be rich, right? And that kind of thing. Like, it's not a one-to-one kind of thing like that. And of course, it's not like your life is going to be perfect because you hear the gospel. That's obviously like not true on this side of eternity. That's just the way it is. I mean, that's why it's this side of eternity, not the other side. Hey, Saiyan 21. How am I doing? I'm doing all right. Things are good. Just going through the book of Luke slowly. I'm glad you're here. welcome. But I'm doing all right. Just a long day, but hey, as I was just saying, we make time for the things that are important to us. And in my mind, my crude method of sharing the gospel to people online through the Streaming Parson channel is one of those things. Because, in my mind, it's important that we get the gospel out there, and this is how I do it. So this is important. And like I said, we all make time for the things that are important. I'm going to skip over the next part here just because we spent a lot of time already in the parable of the sower. But it's one of those things that I know from when people read this people read this passage, and after all that whole spiel I just gave you, you read the next part and you're like, how the hell are these disciples so stupid or something? Where they're like, oh Jesus, I don't know what you mean, even though like the story itself is kind of straightforward. But at the same time, using my borderlining blasphemy moment as reference, the evolution of philosophy within this passage, it's obvious to us now as modern readers, and especially in context of like understanding the rest of the gospel, this is pretty obvious. But it might not have been to the Jews back then. It might not have been, even though the parable is obvious to us now. Okay, thanks for your welcome. Do you mind if I ask you a question? I consider myself an agnostic, and I do want to believe in God. Okay, but I never found an answer for this question, if that's all right. All right, I'll take my shot at it, but I don't have any guarantees for you. I'll tell you that on the outset. But I'm going to keep going through this commentary while you come up with your question. All right, I'm going to go quickly over the lamp on a stand bit, because this is really more of a continuation of this parable of the seed, and it really should not be treated like a separate thing. But basically, Jesus says here, no one lights a lamp and hides it in a clay jar and puts it under a bed. Instead, they put it on a stand. So so that people can see the light. Yada yada yada. Therefore, carefully consider how you listen. Whoever will be given more, and whoever does not listen, what they think they have will be taken away from them. So, once again, this goes back to how I guess my simple way of putting it is, as I mentioned before, we all make time for things. And what Jesus is ultimately saying here with the light and the parable of the sower is, will you make time for God ultimately? Because if you do, then these things like the growth, the spiritual growth, and the light that people will see in you, that will come naturally as you seek God and grow in your spiritual life, yada 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 yada. That will come naturally. And so that's why Jesus brings up the whole, well, what's important is that you are willing to listen and to understand, because then the rest of it will come naturally. Okay, here's your question. Have you heard of the problem of evil? Theophany is its fancy name, but yes. That's really my main question for you, and how would I answer it? So, the funny thing is I actually have kind of answered this in the Book of Kings reading. I have a playlist. Check it out. But basically, my hot take, if you want to call it that, but in my mind, now you got to take this with a grain of salt, because this is more of in my mind kind of thing, and how I understand the Bible. And not all Christians see eye to eye on this. But in my mind, and how I understand the Bible, is that in order for God to be love, now in various parts of the Bible, many people will quote like 1 John and talk about how God is love. Now that's a very interesting word choice to say God is love, as opposed to saying God is loving, because those are two very different things. Because let's say if you say God is loving, there's an implication that there are times he is not. Because you got to think of like how nouns work, right? And nouns and add nouns and whatnot. So when you say God is loving, there's an implication that there are modes he could not be loving, which is not what the Bible does. What the Bible does is it says God is love, which puts him to like an absolute of that noun. But here comes the problem with that part. So the problem of if we say God is loving, then there's the implication he's not loving. But then you run into the problem of like, well then, if there are times where God is not loving, then I don't know if I want to trust that God. There's that problem, right? But if we say God is love, then you run into another problem. And that would be the question you bring up, the theophany thing. But here's my hot take. The hot take is, in order for God to be love, he must allow free will, and not just for human beings, but on a cosmic meta level, for reality itself. Reality must have free will. I know that sounds mega weird, but basically God must allow free will in reality. And the reason why he does this is because in order for God to be love, God must always play the love risk game. Now, I'm going to explain what the love risk game is. So the love risk game is basically this idea that, I'm just going to put my Bible to the side here for a second because it like gets heavy on my lap. Okay, so the love risk game is basically this idea that if you love something, and if you really love something, there has to be a risk of losing it. And there's that old saying, people use this for like those like kind of shitty like romance stories, and when people go through like hard times in those romance stories, they always use this cliche line of like, if you really love her, let her go. If she comes back, then she's really yours, kind of stupid thing like that, right? Don't know if you ever heard that cliche line, but anyway. Now imagine that, but like on a universal level, like applying to all people, and that's how God treats us. So the idea that if God really loves us, then God must be willing to risk losing us. Otherwise, then he wouldn't be loving, or he wouldn't be love if God did the alternate route and was obsessive. And that's why we view obsession as such a bad thing, because obsession, sure, people may say that they're obsessive because of love, but the love is no longer about the thing they love, but rather the love of their own security, and that's why people become obsessive. And so God, he has to allow evil to occur, because in order for people to be free, it must occur, and it must occur so that the love risk game that God is always playing occurs. And so the problem of evil is kind of, see, I know this is where the hot take happens. I'm going to say it's almost necessary, because that's how the love risk game works. If it didn't exist, then the love risk game would not occur, and then we would not know God actually loved us, because there would be no measure of which God could not love us. You couldn't make that measurement. You couldn't say, well, for instance, God being obsessive and then taking away our free will, because we can't imagine a universe like that. Not really. And since we can't really, but since we can gauge what that could be like to an extent, then we know that God is always loving us by allowing us options and allowing reality to have options. Because God loves this universe enough to allow it to choose for itself. Of course, as many Christians would say, well then, unfortunately, because humans are shit, we'll more often than not pick the wrong choices, and that's just because humans are humans and humans are shit, and so we'll tend to pick the wrong choices, and that's why evil occurs as often as it does. But at the same time, it must exist in order for God to love us, because then there would be no need for God for God to have something to give his love toward, if it was just given to him. There wouldn't be a point to that. Why would God need that? And why would God even want to do that? And so that's my answer of why there's that, why evil must exist. Because God is always playing the love-risk game. I brought this up in context of the Book of Kings, if you want a better explanation, like more explanation on it, as I talk about in the Book of Kings. Because one of the things that, the Bible tells us repeatedly, and you scratch your head and you go, why the hell would God put up with the Israelites in context of the Book of Kings? We're like, okay, so, the Israelites, they go and worship other gods, and God's like, yo, seriously, what the shit? Like, don't do that. You know, it's not going to end well for you, yada, yada, yada. But at the same time, God doesn't just stop them from doing it. He tells them that he doesn't like that they worship other gods, but he doesn't just stop them from doing it. And then you wonder, well, why doesn't God just, make people obey him if it's for Israel's best interest? But at the same time, he also says, it's because of my love for you that, I allow you to be free, because I want you to be free people. I'm not like the Egyptians who enslaved you for 400 years. There's that contrast. And so the problem of evil on a grand scale like that is because God must allow reality to choose for itself. Otherwise, he would not be love. God would be like every other dictator if God set everything we must do. The whole like, okay, so funny side illustration, may not have anything to do with anything, but a buddy and I, we were playing Tales of Symphonia. Have you ever played that game? It's a great game. It's an old GameCube game, but anyway, we're playing Tales of Symphonia, and one of the things, and Japanese RPGs love their whole like the idea of paradise is bad, and there it's ironic because I remember as a kid, people would say Japanese RPGs are bad because they preach this idea that paradise is bad. But in Christianity, we also believe that there is paradise in the New Jerusalem, that, in the Book of Revelation, all that. But anyway, but there's an apples to oranges thing going on here. Because what the thing in Japanese RPGs, going to Tales of Symphonia as an example, what they're critiquing as paradise being a bad thing is the idea of humans being removed of free will. And a God that does that to people is not loving. Maybe I should have opened with this, but anyway. And so, if God does not allow people to have free will, does not allow free will to exist, and I'm going to say on a universal level because it goes beyond just human beings as well. You could argue this with nature as well, and talking like nature like as a person. The Book of Romans does this, so I don't see a problem with this. Talking about nature as if it's a person. Well, nature has free will, as weird as that sounds. And nature can do good and nature can do bad. And if you don't think that's true, then there's think of it like this: why is the lifeblood of creation water the most destructive force on the planet? So there's that duality in it. But anyway, going back to Tales of Symphonia as my illustration here, there's a part where there's this tower that leads up to the heavens, if you will, and you meet the angels in that game, and they're pretty emotionless. There's really nothing to them, right? They're just they're robotic is the best way of putting it. And all the characters muse that, like, man, like, is this what Martel, the god of their world, is this what Martel wants to do to us? Like, he wants to turn us into these like robot puppets? Like, is that a life worth living? Is that an eternity worth living? It's, because the angels get to be immortal. Is that an eternity worth living? And the characters muse that, like, oh, actually, it's actually kind of terrible if the price of immortality was to lose all sensation. Like, what kind of God would do that to people? Is kind of what they're getting at in that game. And it's very true. That's a very true idea. And this is actually why a lot of Japanese RPGs critique the idea of paradise. Because is it worth giving up all of that? The idea of like free thought, excuse me, free thought, the ability to love, the ability to feel love. Is that worth immortality? And the easy answer would be, well, no. It's, on a logical sense, we would say, well, that's no. Those things are not worth that. It is not worth giving up, like love, for instance. Like even human love, we value it so highly. And in human love, evil must also exist, because there has to be the possibility of there not being love. But at the same time, you wouldn't understand one without the other as well. Anyway, I've talked about that quite a bit. I hope that's a sufficient answer for you. And like I said, there's so much more that could be said about theophany. So there's your word of the day. That's the fancy word for the problem of evil. It's theophany, and if you need to spell it, that's Theophany. Theophany. And it's the philosophy of God and evil. Is what that word means. But that's my answer for it. I don't know if that's a good enough answer for you, but that's my answer to your question. Like I said, that's my answer. It is not the answer to your question, but I think it's an adequate answer. I think it's something that I've really thought through. I've thought it through that way, but once again, not everyone sees eye to eye on that, because once again, you get Christians that are too much on the like, well, God is in control of everything. But then, of course, in my mind, it's like, well, you cannot attribute to God the idea that he can strip away free will, because then that would take away from other parts of the Bible saying that God is love. That's my logic behind it, because I'm trying to be consistent with those parts of the Bible that talk about, well, God is love. He's not loving, but he is love. And then you read stuff like Exodus where, and go check out my Exodus playthrough. There's always those funny moments where like, God is love, but he's also the Grim Reaper. So like, what's up with that, right? So I was going to ask you about natural evil. Well, that's what I meant about like the free will thing acting on a cosmological level. And then I use like the idea of like, not the priest like Mother Earth religion kind of thing, but the idea like, once again, the book of Romans treats Earth like it is a person, so I'm going to treat it as well. And so nature can do good and evil. Nature does both, because as the Bible actually treats it this way, that nature itself is a person. And then in the book of Romans, Paul uses this weird ass analogy. You just gotta roll with it when you're reading the Bible sometimes. But like, there's this part where in the book of Romans, Paul talks about how like, well, nature groans for God's promise to regenerate and to bring restoration. And this, of course, is Paul's way of explaining the book of Revelation. And so in the book of Romans, Paul talks about how the earth groans like birth pains and is in anger because of it, kind of thing. It's kind of this weird ass analogy. You just gotta roll with it, right? And so the earth itself acts like a person, and like any person, the earth has free will. And so natural evil behaves that way. Because once again, if the universe was perfect, okay, let's flip it a little bit, saying, if the universe was perfect, right? Nothing ever died in this universe. Let's like hypothetically, although that sounds ridiculous, but let's pretend that nothing could die in this universe. Then people would have no reliance for God, because if nothing could die, then why would we need to, like, for example, take care of ourselves? Why would we need to eat better? Why would we need to not wage war and hurt each other, right? If nothing could die, then humans would just be so complacent about existence itself, right? And then it goes back to the Tales of Symphonia, the Tales of Symphonia illustration I was using earlier, where the angels are like these robots, and then it's like, that's a really shitty existence. Would anyone want to live like that? But in order for life to be full, which God also promises us in the book of John, the enemy comes to kill, steal, and destroy, but I've come to give you life, and life to the fullest. Well, how do you get a full life? Right? And this is where, like, once again, a lot of different philosophy ideas have tried to wrestle this idea of what makes a full life and what are some necessities to a full life. And some if you went the more darker route, and I will admit I do go the darker routes because dark humor is what this channel is all about half the time. Half the time it's about it all the time. But basically, a life without misery could not be a happy life. Think of it that way. A life without misery could not be a happy life. Because from a Christian perspective, well, a life without any kind of challenge and hardship, well, then I wouldn't need God. And, as I humorously would say from time to time, if I could do everything myself, I wouldn't need God, right? I think that's a safe assumption, if I could do it all myself. But evil prevents me from doing everything myself. And evil prevents anyone from doing everything themselves and creating their utopian world. But it is when we face that evil, we realize that, like, yeah, I need to be saved from the evil I am capable of. And that's what, Jesus' forgiveness absolves us from. That, that evil within ourselves. Not absolve, that's not the best word, right? Because, of course, the Bible teaches, like, we are forgiven because we know we're not only capable of doing great evil, but to some extent or another, we have all done great evil to some degree. Of course, some people have done worse than others, and some people need to be forgiven of more than others. I talked about that in last week's Bible read, and Jesus talks about the whole two debtors thing. But that's my tackle on evil. God is omnipotent, though, right? Meaning he can do anything. Can't he just make it so that we as humans will always freely choose to do the right thing? He is omnipotent, after all. Well, that goes back to the problem we were talking about earlier, right? That if God just became obsessive, that's the word I use. He became obsessive and made it so that we would do whatever he wanted. That would not be love. That is how a tyrant acts. A tyrant makes us do things and eliminates choice. Because, see, the wording you're using undermines the reality of it. Because if, let's say, this is a terrible analogy, but you gotta roll with this, right? Because I can't think of a better one. You think of, like, any kind of, like, socialist government and says your choices are you get in line or we kill you. That's not a choice now, is it? Right? That's an ultimatum. But ultimatums are done by tyrants who don't care about the people but want to control them. So in your wording here, well, God is omnipotent. He can make it, he can do anything. Can't he just make it so that we as humans will always freely choose to do the right thing? Well, that's contradicting, right? You can't make someone do something free. That's an oxymoron. That doesn't work. So God can't make us choose the right thing, because then that's not a choice. That's an ultimatum, and ultimatums are what tyrants make people do. So once again, that the God being all powerful factor would say that that's how much more careful, if you will. That's not the best word I have. That's the best word I have, but it's not very good. But the more careful, quote unquote, God has to be in being love, because he cannot cross that line. Because then he wouldn't be love, and then he wouldn't be God, right? So then you run into that problem. So this, and once again, this goes back, like, use Tales of Symphonia as my analogy again. Well, God could make people choose, quote unquote, the right choices, but then it is always based on God's image, and not God's image. That's a poor choice of words. It's like, basically, it's always based on, like, God's angle and agenda at all times, as opposed to allowing people to be free. Because what does it mean to be free? Because being free that's a pretty loaded term, right? So being free, there are so many lines that cannot be crossed, and God choosing to not cross them. I mean, you could argue that's being all powerful right there, because God easily has the power to just deny all of that and be like, whatever, I do what I want. That is the easy way of doing things. But in order for God to play the love risk game that he's always playing, he must allow us to be free. And to be free means he cannot violate all those things that freedom allows for us. At this rate, I'm not going to read chapter 9. But I also don't mind these discussions, because this is important. It's important. If I can help you in your spiritual life. Well, no, that's just besides the point. Saying I know we're picking at hairs here when you take like socialist or communist country, or government, but the idea of a tyrant telling people that they have like a choice or die kind of thing. And that's basically the idea of making someone choose, quote unquote, making someone freely choose. You can't make someone do something free, if that makes sense. Then that's not real freedom. A person can, a free person always has the option to say no to anything being suggested. A free person always has a choice to say no, just as much as they have the power to say yes. It has certainly given me food for thought, which is different than most other discussions I've had with others. Well, I'm thankful that you're thinking about it, and it's important that we always think. And saying, I don't know if you've ever caught, like, I've been doing Bible stream reads for like a year now, and something I've always it's stuff like it's people like you that remind me, and should remind other Christians, honestly, in my mind. It's a reminder of why it's so important to be like mega sharp in how we read the Bible, study the Bible, etc. That's why this channel exists. But it's so important that we're really, really sharp, because the biggest thing, and this is where, like, as I mentioned before, all of us are capable of great evil. Imagine the evil done by religious people, though not because they intentionally do evil, but by intellectual laziness, by apathy, by, I don't know, what other factor could we put, but like intellectual laziness and apathy. A Christian could do great evil by misleading other people, and even pushing people away from Jesus and the gospel because of apathy or something like that. But in my mind, I like to believe that, like, no, I'm always sharp. I'm always prepared for these kind of things, because yes, a purpose has an agenda, right? My idea is, I I want to lead you to Christ, and I'm willing to do it through the most intellectual rigors, because that's how I know how to do it. And so I make sure that these things, I foster this kind of like discussion and open talk, because at the same time, that is how some people come to faith as well. I mean, to be fair, similar for me as well, is to have these kind of, because I'm a bit of a thinker too, if it isn't obvious. But I'm a bit of a thinker too, and so it's important that we are able to talk about these things and be explorative about it. And I think many Christians do a major disservice by not doing that. And one of the biggest dangers, and this is where, once again, in the book of in the book of Timothy, Paul tells Timothy, teachers will be judged harshly before God, because you are accountable when if you're going to tell people about God, you better do it right. Is kind of what Paul is getting at. And I am very much in that mindset. So when we have discussions like this, it's just a perfect reminder of like why, we really need to think about these things. And of course, once again, we must always be biblical about it, at least to the best of our abilities, but we must be biblical about it and do what we must to really seek God and lead others to do that as well. But, you're welcome for my answer, and I thank you as well for the discussion, because it's always important to have these kind of talks. And that's also why I have the podcast thing on Mondays, because we can always do something like this. I'm actually supposed to be reading through Luke, so we're gonna go back to that. But thank you for that question, and I'm glad I've given you some food for thought. Ah, crap. Where was I? Oh yeah. So thank you for answering your question. Yeah, no problem. That's why this that's why I'm here, is to help people and growth in their spiritual lives. Okay, let's keep reading through chapter 8. I'm gonna speed through. Okay, I'm gonna skip the mothers and brothers part because it's kind of whatever. Let's talk about the storm part. Now, there's multiple parts in the Bible where Jesus calms like the elements. That's the best way of doing it. The best way of wording it, where Jesus like alters the elements with words. And in chapter 8, verse 22 to, let's say, 25 is a story where Jesus, he's on a boat. To be fair, Jesus would often be on a boat because half of his disciples are all fishers. So, they all own boats. They probably go from some places using a boat. That makes sense. So here we have Jesus on a boat, and he's taking a nap. And it just so happens that when he's taking a nap, there's got to be a storm, right? Because I guess the Bible likes doing that. So he's taking a nap, and there's a storm, and his disciples are freaking out, as they should be. Because, of course, once again, is the contrast between God and people. And human beings are always... And this is where, once again, to kind of play on the stuff we talked about earlier with like humans and the problem of evil, the human side of it, is that the reason why humans can be quick to do evil and even justify evil is because humans are really short-sighted. And to be fair, mortality will do that to you. The fact that you only have so long on this earth, you only view reality within the context of your own life. Go check out my podcast on time is weird. But anyway, basically humans are really short-sighted. And the disciples behave in this way. And on the one hand, you can't be too harsh on them, because if you were one of the disciples on a boat in a storm, you'd do the same thing. And so they wake him up, and Jesus is like, well, where's your faith? Where's your trust in me? And I know some people are quick to criticize moments like this, where like, well, it's easy for Jesus to be like, relax in a storm. He's God after all. He can control the weather and stuff. That's not a problem for him. But human beings can't do that, so it's a problem for us. But what Jesus is talking about here is, and this is where the word faith is kind of like not properly used from time to time, I guess you could say. Where it's like, okay, when Jesus says, well, where's your faith? Well, what the heck does he even mean by that in this context? And so, the typical Christian answer of what faith is the idea that we trust in God. And the way you value your faith, quote unquote, is how you trust God in whatever situation of your life. And I think that's where the storm analogy keeps coming up in the Bible, especially in the Gospels, because of course storms represent uncertainty. They represent chaos. They represent the reality of how close death is at any given time, right? I mean, that goes along with the chaos thing, but I had to spell that out a little bit. But basically, yeah, storms represent chaos. And of course, with that being said, you could bring it back to the creation story. The creation story, and how, God creates order in the midst of chaos, kind of. analogy. That's where, like, once again, there's the whole waters thing and separating the waters and all that in the creation story. And it's this idea that storms are equated to chaos, and when Jesus calms a storm, once again, it's that parallel with the creation story, that he speaks order into chaos. But human beings, hey dude, just want to let you know I gotta go now since it's quite late. I'll definitely try and come back for some of your other streams though. Stay safe. Hey, you have a great night as well. We got, I hope you have a good weekend as well, because it is the weekend. I mean, I assume if it's late for you, I mean, it's still kind of early for me. It's only like 4:30 right now. But if it's late for you, maybe it's already Saturday or something, for all I know. Where I live is weird. But anyway, you stay safe as well. You have a great weekend. And yeah, hope to see you around. Leave that like, subscribe, and come hang out more on these streams. Anyway, back to the story. Or back to the whole talk about storms thing and how there's an interesting parallel and dynamic. It's past midnight in the UK. Fair enough. But you have a good night then. Yeah, I guess it's about right. Yeah. See, it's only like 4:30 here. So, but yeah, see you later. Anyway, so the interesting contrast is how God sees the world, if you will, and how humans and their short-sightedness can lead them to doubt and falling away from God, if you will. And one of the funny things is I'm gonna bring the storm story back to the parable of the sower, because I think it applies there. And once again, I think that's why the parable of the sower, so many pastors preach on it, and the whole chapter kind of revolves around this parable. The people that, whether they can hear the word of God and pay attention to the gospel, versus people who don't. And the storm story kind of justifies that whole second option of people getting caught in the chaos, and then they can't hear the word, if you will. They can't hear the word because they're too caught in the chaos of things, as opposed to what I was talking about earlier with the deliberately deaf thing. But here the disciples, and Jesus even calls them out on it. It's like, where's your faith, right? And this going back with the people caught in the thorns, if you will. So there's a parallel between the thorns and the storm now. The choker of life kind of thing. All right, then let's go to this. Oh my goodness, there's so much here in chapter 8. Anyway, see, like I said, there's a lot in chapter 8. And we'd be lucky we made it through 8 and 9. I'm just gonna check chapter 9 actually. Oh crap. Okay, that's pretty long. Anyway, well, we'll see. Because I know we had that long detour, but hey, it's always important to talk about stuff like that. And I'm always willing to take on questions like that too. But anyway, let's talk about Legion. Oh yes, a popular reference right here. So the story of Legion, and the famous misquote, just like the Luke, I am your father, is actually a misquote. For those of you who don't know, come on, if you don't know that reference, like, what are you even doing here? But the Luke, I am your father is not the actual line, but when Darth Vader says Luke, and well, when people misquote it and say Luke, I am your father, it puts the context in for you, because the actual line is, Luke Skywalker's going like, Obi-Wan told me you were the one who killed my father, and Darth Vader says, no, I am your father. That moment. And so I brought that up because there's the famous misquote, which comes from this story as well, is the we are legion, I am legion for we are many. The for we are many is actually a misquote, because that is not what is said with this character, Legion. But rather, the Bible just does a narration thing and says, for there were many demons in this one, like, there were many demons possessing one guy. And thus is why the demon names itself as Legion. Of course, there's another interesting thing about about the whole choosing the name Legion, because of course, one, and you'll see this a little bit later in the story, where if Jesus is in a more Gentile land, as in not Jewish, and that's why maybe, you know, the Gerasenes was a more Gentile place, and there's the whole thing, the implication of that is with all the pigs. Then there's this, once again, this clash between the Jewish culture and the pagan, right? There's a little clash in that. And so I think that the naming of Legion is interesting, because of course a legion refers to 1,000-unit troop in the Roman army. It's called a legion, as a legion refers to 1,000. And I think it's kind of interesting that the Bible does this and kind of makes this distinction between, with this particular demon, that his name is Legion, and this distinction that is there, and the implications that it carries. And, you know, Jesus fighting against the quote-unquote gods of the world, if you will. Which has interesting parallels with, for instance, the book of Exodus, and the way that God does the 10 plagues. Because it's also kind of a contrast to the Egyptian pantheon. In this case, with Jesus and Legion, there's this Jesus versus the world, quote unquote the world, and Legion being a representative of Roman military might. You know, the way the Romans took over the world, if you will, was through their military might. And I think there's a, it's interesting that that's kind of there. I don't know, and I can't say, because obviously I don't know, and no one can really know. You know, one of those things you'll have to ask when you get to the other side of it, the other side of eternity. But was this was that intentional, or how was it to be intentional of the demon having that name, Legion, and this contrast between, you know, Jesus and the powers of the world represented through Roman military might. Because, you know, the funny thing is, like, in pop culture, when like movies that have to deal with like demon possession or whatever, and demon monsters and whatnot, and they have the Legion character, the famous misquote, "I am Legion for we are many," but he doesn't like, in the Bible, Legion doesn't actually say that. He just says, "My name is Legion," and then the Bible commentates and says, "Because there were many demons in this one guy," which then kind of shows like how, like, that's kind of interesting that there's like, unlike traditional, if you will, possession stories. I know that sounds really messed up when you say it out loud. Traditional possession stories. But unlike traditional possession stories, you know, you think of like one demon possesses one dude or whatever. But here it's like, no, this interesting fellow who's been living in tombs and apparently possesses superhuman strength, as he can break chains that, you know, tie him to a wall and everything. He's possessed by many demons, and of course there's something interesting that Jesus brings up later in his teachings. I don't know if we'll cover that today, because it's already like 4:40 and we're not even to chapter 8 yet. But, oh well. It is what it is. But with the Legion story, it's kind of interesting that, another thing that's kind of interesting is that it kind of goes against a lot of angelology and demonology mythologies that have been growing, especially by this time period. Because, as I mentioned, I can't remember when I mentioned this, but basically in Jewish thought, there was an evolution of how they understood the world of angels and demons during, let's say, I don't know, like 500 BC. Because, of course, prior to that, there was this idea of like, it was just God versus the gods of other religions and other pantheons. It was just God. It was just Yahweh versus all of them, and there were no secondary like angels and demons or whatever. Of course, then there was the common thing of just mashing the pagan gods with demons and saying they were one and the same. There's that, you know, thinking that was around, but it wasn't refined as that way in ancient thought, and not for a long time. Like I said, 500 BC is, in the context of what we're reading here, like in like Bible story world, that's a pretty recent phenomenon. And once again, I'm going back with like the book of Exodus as my reference point. The book of Exodus, it definitely did not treat it that way. It was just God doing stuff, and then he battles other gods, and then just shows them up because, well, as God would say, they're not gods. Only I am God. Is basically what he does. Is basically what he says. But the conflict between like God and then these lesser beings that claim to be gods is kind of how you should look at that. Of course, once again, the evolution of angelology and demonology kind of just said, okay, then he was battling a bunch of demons posing as people. And there's that whole thing too, where how in Hebrew thought, the ancient, the gods of other religions were basically demons masquerading as people, as super powerful people. And so the but I mean that but even with that being said, the like before 500 BC, it wasn't really thought that way. It wasn't really thought of like, well, they were demonic monsters posing as people, not like Dracula in Castlevania, right? He's not a monster posing as a man. Or sorry, in Dracula's case in Castlevania, he is a monster posing as a man, but in Hebrew thought they would not have thought of it that way. That is that's a much more evolved and more recent idea of how they treated other spiritual forces that were not from God. Because of course there was, well, God, and then there were other spiritual forces acting on earth. And so the explanation that later became more popularized was the whole like they were demons and stuff like that. And that mythos went on a whole crazy train that we still use today. So, and it's still growing because that's how we have evolved that kind of thinking. But anyway, going back to the parallel between Jesus and Legion, it's kind of interesting because it harkens back to the much more older idea, right? It's not thinking like you shouldn't think of the Jesus versus Legion as like angelology, demonology kind of thing, but rather Yahweh fighting against the forces of the world, the worldly powers, quote unquote, and how God overcomes those things, just like he does in the book of Exodus, the same way he does it here. And the naming of Legion is meant to signify more of the Roman power, more than it's like, oh, a fancy demon name. Because I'm pretty sure if you read like actual angel and demon mythologies in like even Jewish culture, I'm sure demons had way more cooler names than Legion of all things. But anyway, the book of Luke harkens back to that much more older era, which I think is kind of interesting that it does that. And that's how you should actually read this part. Is Jesus overcomes the world, which is also something that, you read like the book of Romans, for instance, and there's a lot of that kind of language Paul uses, where it's like, oh, and how God overcomes the world. And part of that is because like, well, what's the point of talking about like spiritual things where like they're of little to no concern for people like you and me, right? The bulk of these like epic spiritual battles between like angels and demons and like higher planes of existence, like those things don't really matter to us, not in the grand scheme of things. And going back with like that one comment way earlier with like what makes a person saved and what doesn't, it's that kind of thing, right? Like there are things that like, okay, these things are really cool and they improve spiritual life and all that, but in the grand scheme of things they don't matter that much. Because what decides a person is saved? The belief in Jesus and accepting him as our savior. That's what decides it. Like it seems pretty small in the grand scheme of things, but that is what decides it. So if that's the case, you don't need to worry about these more fantastical aspects of spiritual life because they ultimately don't matter. And so in the same vein, I think the Legion story is meant to be treated that way. That it's just God overcomes the forces of the world, and all the more reason that we put our focus on Jesus as opposed to anyone else and anything else. So that's my meta commentary on the Legion story. There's a whole bunch of other stuff that could be said, but I don't think it's necessary. I mean, let me put it this way: you could go listen to any pastor's like sermon on this story, and they all say the same kind of thing, and that would be the rest of the commentary. But I'm gonna save time by not mentioning it. But just go look up some other pastors like sermon on this story. They'll tell you exactly what I would tell you as well. So I'm gonna just save it for today and move on. The next story though, I do want to pay more attention to this one, and I was originally going to spend more time on this story. I like this one quite a bit. I know like people would say, Jesus driving out a demon is pretty awesome. You think that would be the like highlight story, but I was like, no, I think this next story is a lot more interesting. And it's a story about Jesus basically healing two women, because one of them's a 12-year-old girl, but we'll say two women for the sake of simplicity. So Jesus heals two women in this story, and the first one is one that's he's asked to heal. And it's interesting that we have this guy named Jairus here, and the Bible mentions how he's a leader of a synagogue, which, with all the other stuff we've just read, would have been pretty bold for a Pharisee, or not even a Pharisee, but a elite of the Jewish life and Jewish society would actually come to Jesus, because we have all these other guys that are all like very antagonistic. They're all thinking Jesus is a blasphemer for forgiving sins and stuff like that. But Jairus here, very different attitude. But I guess it's one of those things where, once again, using the storm story as reference, the short-sightedness of human beings. And how fickle human beings can be. Because the Bible never tells us whether like Jairus was originally antagonistic toward Jesus or whatever. The Bible never tells us that. But what the Bible does tell us is that like Jairus, he thinks his only option in regards to his daughter is Jesus. That's what we do know. And so Jairus makes this bold move by approaching Jesus and asking him to heal his daughter, even though his buddies may all be very antagonistic toward that idea. But at the same time, Jairus can't deny what's been happening in these other towns where Jesus has been doing healings and bringing miracles and whatever. He can't deny that. So he's at his wit's end. And there's that little bit of human short-sightedness as well. Like Jesus as a last resort, and that's fair. You can't really criticize anyone for thinking that. But Jesus as, his last resort to save his daughter. And so Jairus asks Jesus for help. And once again, that's pretty bold. And I think it shows that level of compassion in Jesus, that despite that, on any other day, Jairus and Jesus probably would have been enemies. But here, in Jairus' hour of need, Jesus agrees to help him. And this is, once again, one of those like very Christian ideas, as I keep mentioning. This idea that like, well, that's what Christianity is about, how God forgives his enemies and loves his enemies, aka us. And there's that interesting dynamic between like God and man, God versus man, in a lot of old religious thinking. And this is also true in the Bible as well. There's antagonism between God and people. And this is illustrated here again with Jesus and Jairus. But at the same time, what Christianity does that's kind of radical as a worldview is that instead of being stuck in this whole God versus man dynamic, it's God really wants to help us, and God wants to be there for us, even though on many occasions we would be God's enemies, through sin and selfish desires, willfully deaf, and stuff like that. Where we more often than not choose to be God's enemies. As I pointed out to the saying earlier when we were talking about the problem of evil, well, we would more often choose to be God's enemies then we would choose to be his friend. But at the same time, even though humans are shit like that, God isn't. God would not turn us. God would not turn us away, and God is always desiring to help us. And this is shown in Jesus willing to help Jairus, even though probably on another day, like Jairus would be included in the kind of people Jesus would criticize for hypocrisy and stuff like that. It's very possible that that could also be the case. Of course, we haven't gone too deep into any of those passages where Jesus chews out Pharisees, but that's what he does here. He decides to help out Jairus instead of abandoning him. And that just shows, the part where we always talk about like Jesus is so compassionate. This is like when Christians use that as a throwaway line. It's moments like this that we really see Jesus's compassion. That even though on another day they would be like Jesus and Jairus would be like arch enemies on like on any other occasion. That's the word I was thinking, the phrasing I was thinking of. On any other occasion, Jesus and Jairus would be like basically arch enemies because Jairus is part of this social religious elite in the Jewish world, and Jesus is the guy who's breaking all these like religious taboos, right? So they would have been arch enemies, but here Jesus' compassion overshines, what would be the reality, and that is that instead of being enemies, Jesus is showing compassion to him. And this is something that many a Christian would say like, well, that's all the more reason that we can trust in Jesus and believe in him, because that's how Jesus views us. Jesus loves us enough that he's willing to put aside all the times we've antagonized God and gone up against God, and God is willing to forgive that. And that's definitely true in this case. And it's not like I disagree with the Christianese, but I prefer to explain that as opposed to just using the throwaway lines. But that's basically what the Bible's getting at here with Jairus, and I think that's interesting. But continuing the little story, there's this little excerpt in the middle of the Jairus story. So the Jairus story is it has the two ends here. It has Jairus appeals to Jesus for help, and in the ending story as well, Jesus does the miracle that Jairus asks for. But in between that, there's this little interesting story, and I think this story is actually pretty interesting too. It's the story of this woman with, we're just going to say it's a hemorrhage problem. That's my safest bet. It's a hemorrhage problem. And I know a lot of people criticize this part of the story because many people refer to Luke as a doctor, but he's more historian than he is a doctor. He may have been Paul's like personal, like medical assistant, like not medical assistant, that's not the right word. Like, okay, so I gotta backtrack a bit here. So we gotta talk about Luke, the writer, a little bit, and many people misinterpret and not misinterpret. Well, maybe misinterpret might be the right word, but basically they misinterpret Luke as being a doctor. But there are evidence like this here where Luke is not what we would see as modern view as a doctor. Like if Luke was a doctor, he should have been able to name what this bleeding thing was. And they do have like medical names back then like they do now. Okay. It's not like the ancient world, they had no names for any diseases and we all came up with it because we're so smart in 2022. That's not how it is. But with that being said, if Luke really was a like PhD doctor, he would have known what this was and would have just called it what it was. But he doesn't. Instead, he just refers that she had this like bleeding for a long time. Now, once again, I'm gonna say it's like a hemorrhage thing, maybe. That's the easiest way to go about it. But it could have been all kinds of things, and there's that we don't know. But if Luke really were the PhD doctor, that he would have been able to name it, but he doesn't. So this is why more accurately Luke is a historian, because that's what he's actually doing. He's being an historian. But I think the misconception comes from in the book of Acts as well as the book of Corinthians. Paul makes a reference to this, that Luke is the guy who takes care of Paul and helps him out with Paul's physical ailments, and this is where you go to like the book of Galatians as well, where Paul talks about how he has various medical problems, and Luke helps him out with that. But at the same time, Luke is not like a doctor. Luke is just someone who really takes care. Like, he takes care of Paul and does his best with like his limited skill of first aid and whatever. But I don't think like Luke would have been like a professional doctor or a surgeon or anything like that, because the Bible certainly does not suggest that he was. The only hints that we get that Luke has some knowledge of medical know-how would be that he helps Paul because Paul does have some kind of medical condition. The Bible also is not clear on what that is either. So, once again, like if we actually had like a PhD doctor writing these manuscripts, which we didn't because they're historians, not doctors. Historians are not required to know medical names for stuff. Doctors are, and so that's why it's easy to say Luke was a historian, and I would refer to him as one. And I know some people say like the Doctor Luke. I'm like, no, he wasn't a doctor. He may have had some know-how in first aid and caretaking because he did do that, but I wouldn't say he's a doctor. He's definitely a historian though, as we read here, and the book of Luke is a reliable historical document. Because I know some people would try and be a smartass and say like, well, the Bible might be fiction, so maybe Luke isn't a historian either. But aside from outlandish claims like that, it's safe to say Luke wasn't an historian. And to be fair, there are other documents written by Luke, although they're once again more biblical documents. So once again, people will take that with a grain of salt. Take it with a grain of salt. But for example, recording a lot of the early creeds of the early churches during the first century, which once again Christians had some records of this. Luke may have very well written a lot of them. So there's that. But anyway, the reason why I bring up the whole Luke probably wasn't really a doctor was because we had this funny story with this woman here with this hemorrhage. That's what I'm going to call it. And she had been suffering from it for a long time. Once again, the likelihood that it being a minor hemorrhage was because, well, if she's been suffering this for a long time and hasn't died yet, it might not have been major, but at the same time, it's one of those things that like I hate to word it this way, but it's kind of unfortunate that this is how it is. But in anyone who suffers through long-term medical condition, they know this to be true, and it sucks that this happens. But basically, even if it's not like a big issue, your medical condition, even if it's not a big issue, people generally have a stigma toward it. And I know some people are gonna route like ableism, but I mean, like people do that, and we're all guilty of it to some extent, I'm sure. But you don't think of like people willing to date someone with a medical condition, and in this woman's case, this minor hemorrhage, and no doubt she like if she and this is the interesting thing, if she survived this long, it probably wasn't major, because if it was major, she'd be dead already. You would not be fighting a hemorrhage thing for 12 years if it was like a serious case. You'd be dead long before 12 years, I'll tell you that much. But at the same time, because she's been, she does have it, it makes her, well, one, there's the whole Jewish law thing of being unclean if you're like bleeding, because you don't want to touch other people's blood in general. That's just a kind of a given. But no doubt, like you wouldn't want to. Let's just say you wouldn't want to get in bed with a woman that was bleeding a lot. That's kind of messed up, right? You wouldn't want to do that. And so, in this woman's mind, if she continuously has this bleeding problem, well, dating prospects out the window. Right? No one's gonna be tapping that. So that's why she probably really wanted to be healed, because like she wants to get on the dating market, and of course ancient world women problems, I guess you could say. If you're not married, you're in big doo doo, right? So she was willing to, her faith kind of comes out of desperation, right? She's willing to try anything, and similar with Jairus, and that's why the two stories are put together. There's this whole like Jesus as the last resort kind of thing, which once again, I know it's easy to criticize, like, oh, Jesus should never be your last resort, but at the same time, that's more often true. It's just how it is. To say otherwise would be a lie. Let's just go with that. But basically, this woman is like, maybe Jesus will heal me. Maybe this will be the thing that, you know, absolves me from this problem. Because once again, by having this minor hemorrhage case, it would be an eternal damper on her life from any kind of financial security and finding a man, romantic. I mean, not to say that a woman's identity is all within like, finding a man thing, but at the same time, in the ancient world, it was pretty important. And I mean, it's just important to the human condition in general. So, no sex if you got the hemorrhage thing, because who would want to touch that? Most rational people, honest with themselves, and this is where, like, once again, I know some people say ableism, but at the same time, it's like, let's be realistic, right? And it's just one of those things that just sucks in real life. And before people like, it's one of those things that people love, like, calling out other people for, like, oh, you wouldn't date a person that has like a physical, like a disability or something. It's like, well, would you? And the fact of the matter is, it ain't easy. It would be way tougher. Like, okay, my relationship life is like, okay, we're both able-bodied, we're both in good health and whatnot, so it's easy for us. But I know people, and I've mentioned this before, and I definitely mentioned it on Berg's stream, so I don't mind talking about it here. But like, for instance, I have a younger brother who's fighting cancer, and it even, and this was before COVID, so like, we all make jokes that COVID made like all the dating pools just like take a nosedive, like dating out the window. Well, it sucks to say it, but like, and it sucks that this is how it is, but like, my brother, dating prospects out the window, right? Because most rational women, and you can't, on the one hand, you can't blame them. You can't blame them for thinking this. And why would they be interested in a guy like my brother? Because he's sick, right? And it's just how it is. And I'm not gonna cry ableism, because that would be disingenuous. But at the same time, that's kind of how it was, and that's how it still is. So we read this story in the Bible, and people may think, well, why? Like, if her bleeding case isn't like super severe, she could keep living with it. If apparently she's not going to die from it, she's already going 12 years strong without, she can keep fighting. But at the same time, to desire that full cure, if you will, from Jesus, why would you not? Because consider how terrible her life is at this moment. Just like you can think of anyone with any kind of severe illness today, and why would they not? Why would they not want to be made whole, and how important that is? But the beauty of this story is that even the little things like that, Jesus will take notice of. And it's funny how the Bible tells it, though, because like, first the woman touches the edge of his cloak, and then Jesus like stops the crowd. And he's like, "Who touched me?" And I love Peter's response. He's like, "Who isn't touching you?" We're like, like we're running through this huge ass crowd. What do you mean, who touched me, right? This huge ass crowd is like, everybody's trying to get to you. And then Jesus says like, well, I felt power come out of me. It's like, well, I mean, if the whole omnipotence thing, it shouldn't matter if any power left him, because he's got an infinite supply. But at the same time, Jesus is like, well, power left me. And Jesus makes that note. And it's interesting that, with that contrast of, okay, God being all powerful, but then Jesus feels a little power leaving him. It's interesting. There's an interesting thing that in that dynamic where God does pay attention to the little things, right? Because you would think like, all powerful, a little bit of like power to heal one person would be like, whatever. right? Like, that's like a billionaire throwing like a nickel. I mean, and even then, right? Because infinite is, you can't quantify omnipotence, but you get the idea. Like a billionaire would not notice a nickel. But Jesus notices a little bit of power leaving him to heal this woman. And the main point of this little excerpt in the middle of this Jairus story is that even in the midst of Jesus's compassion and, you know, throwing in the context of Jesus's main mission of spreading the word, the gospel to all people, and repentance and all that, right? And Jesus doing all that in the little things like a woman like this wanting a little bit of help, it is not beneath Jesus. And of course, you know, the Christianese thing is to say like, well, Jesus pays attention to all of us and all our needs. And so I really got to update that description thing because I noticed that it's wrong. I'm not reading chapter 9. I already realized it's like 5:05, and chapter 9 would be its own long stream. So now I just have to concede that, like, dude, I'd be like if I get to the book of Acts at this rate. Ah! But anyway, oh, sorry for yelling into the mic like that. But so, well, I mean, on the one hand, you know, I think this is a case in point, right, where the little things, they're not beneath God, and, you know, to follow that example, the little things can't be beneath me. And so I don't, you know, talking with the saying, for instance, it's the little things, right, that God pays attention to. And that's really important reminder for all of us, because it's so easy to think that, like, in this big ass crazy world, and it's easy for, especially when, like, nowadays, because of like a lot of the stuff going on in the world, and I don't want to go too deep into that without getting too political, but with all the crazy stuff going on in the world right now, and it's so easy for people to talk about how, like, oh, maybe there are these big motions and big plans that God is gonna set up in the midst of the craziness of the world. And obviously that's true. That's true as well. But at the same time, don't forget, you know, God is with us in the little things. Jesus is with you in the little things in your life. And that's the beauty of this story, actually. It's funny because, you know, I only talked about the Legion thing for like 10 minutes. But I could go on and on about this story, about this young woman and her hemorrhage. I could go on and on about it, because the fact of the matter is, it's stuff like this is the stuff we really need in our life. Sure, it's easy to go on about how God will fight our battles in the big crazy world, and God, you know, overcomes the world. It's so easy to get caught up in that and focus on those things only. But you can't sacrifice when the little things in our lives. And one of the things we should be grateful of is how God pays attention to us in the small things. I'm sorry, I'm talking through the water thing. I should not be doing that. I should have just waited, but we're already at the end of it. But I'm gonna say that again. And, you know, it's easy to focus on how God is going to overcome the world, as we read with the Legion story and reading with the Jairus story to an extent. Well, not really Jairus story, but definitely the Legion story. And, you know, you see the world today, and many people focus on the Legion story of the world today. But it's so easy to forget about God's compassion in the little things, in the day-to-day miracles that you and I need, the day-to-day words of encouragement, the day affirmation of God's love in our life, God's compassion in our life, etc. It's so easy to forget about the little things like that. But you read a story like this where, you know, one sick girl, just by touching his hem, is healed. And God recognizes it. Even though, you know, he's got other things to do. But he recognizes the little things that we can take comfort that God notices those things in our lives too. And that's, the real meaning of compassion. That Jesus takes notice of the small, the insignificant, like you and me. And so I've always liked this story. I think it's far more profound than the rest of than the other stories. Because it's in those little things. And I remember reading a book when I was in seminary. This is a long time ago. I don't even know if I have the book anymore. It's a book about how, our the distractions in our life can also be our ministry, because it's all about the small things, right? And so the book was about how this pastor, he works in a church or whatever. But one of the interesting ministry projects that he didn't really realize was a big part of his ministry until like the guy came back to him years later, and how he kind of met with someone once in a while. They would have coffee, talk about God, whatever. And then years later, the guy himself became saved and was, doing ministry of his own. And the author was talking about how it was that was his ministry too, like just reaching out to this guy and having coffee with him, and the little things in life, right? As opposed to just the grandeur. I do church services every Sunday. It's the little things, and of course that stems out from how Jesus pays attention to the little things in our lives. It is in those details that the gospel reaches to us. And that goes back to the parable of the sower as well. To hear God and the word of God, it doesn't have to be the spectacular thing. It can happen. I'm not downplaying the spectacular, when Jesus casts out a demon. But sometimes just little things where the sick girl needs help. A person that would normally be God's enemy needs help. And Jesus has compassion for them and helps them. Just a little end note. That was also the kind of thing I was talking about back in last year. But, okay, so being a smartass aside, at the end of December last year, so basically a month ago, and I was talking about how, as we go into 2022, and January is over, so your trial month is over. You're officially... Crap. Sorry. Your trial month is over for 2022. You're knee deep in this now. But with that said, how are you going to go through 2022? And I talked about back in December about how be the blessing you want to see. Go out, bless others. Be the change in 2022 you want to be. That's how I started it. The Christian version of that would be the blessing you want to see in other people's lives and in your own life too. And that was Jesus's agenda. Jesus's agenda when in these stories was being that blessing, bringing that life to people. Because it would be easy for Jesus to just like talk about how I'm here to give you life and then do nothing. But here he is being that lifeblood to all the people that he encounters. And I think this story here with this woman with the bleeding really emphasizes that pretty well. And I think that's why I really like this story compared to the rest of, well, even in this chapter alone. But compared to a lot of other stories too, I think the story is extremely profound in that regard. So don't ever feel that you're too insignificant for God to pay attention to, because God will take notice. Even when you you get a little from God. And the funny thing in the story is like a little bit of power leaves Jesus and he notices it, even though in the grand scheme of things, like he's done way more spectacular things and acts like no big deal. I mean, in between like calming a storm and driving out a demon, and then he's gonna raise a girl from the dead. Those are all pretty big things. And Jesus acts like those things are no big deal. But then here, a little bit of power leaves them. He's just like, oh, who touched me? And because Jesus, he notices. He notices the insignificant, like you and me. But that's all the more reason that we know we can trust him, because God does care for people like us. Just to finish the chapter 8, and then we're gonna end the stream. Wow, this is a new record of me failing on, what is it, like week 3? I failed on like doing what I actually said I was gonna do. But I mean, one of the beauties of streams like this is that we can just go with it. I guess maybe I shouldn't be trying to be so rigid on my planning. Not like I was with the Old Testament books, but that's fine. Maybe 2022 needs that change of pace. But let's just finish chapter 8, and then we're gonna end the stream. So we go. I know it's gonna sound kind of jarring here, because we go from like this moment of how God pays it, like the significance of God paying attention to something so small, and then here is like God raises a girl from the dead and acts like it's no big deal. It's one of those things that's just like one of those things when you read the Bible and you kind of laugh at it, because it is kind of like silly. And I think the Bible writers obviously had fun when they did stuff like this, because I think, once again, Christians can laugh at themselves. It's just part of good life, right? You can laugh at yourself, and God has a sense of humor. He can laugh at himself. So, Jesus, like, he raises a girl from the dead, something far more spectacular than this like insignificant woman or whatever, right? And Jesus acts like it's no big deal. He's just like, oh yeah, get this girl something to eat, and then don't go like announcing it to everybody. Even though, like, what do you think people are gonna do when like their daughter, who's like dying, like is restored? And the book of Luke tells us she was actually dead at one point. But let's say from the perspective of the ordinary people, right? Where girl's dying and Jesus heals her, like she's like completely healthy again. Like, how are people not going to talk? This is one of those funny things too, and this is the first of many, I think, where Jesus tells them like, "Oh, don't tell, don't say this, don't talk about this to anyone." And then you're thinking like, how's this guy not going to talk? How are they not going to talk? Like, something phenomenal happens. But it's funny because Jesus acts like it's no big deal. It's like, yeah, raise a girl from the dead on Tuesday, right? He just like, yeah, it's just something he does. And it's kind of, I think it's kind of funny that the chapter 8 ends that way. And the Bible translator thought it was funny to do it that way. But we had like 3 spectacular moments of like God's miracles, if you will, and then one kind of minor healing, and then the 3 big one, the three that you think God would make a bigger deal of, he'd like, yeah, whatever, no big deal. just treats it like another day. And I think it's kind of funny. It's one of those funny things when you read the Bible and you notice stuff like this, and you can't help but laugh because it is kind of silly. But at the same time, I mean, the Bible's got a good sense of humor and stuff like that. So I think that's what makes reading the Bible enjoyable, when you can look at stuff like that and find what makes it funny. I swear, kids, the Bible is not a boring book. I know a lot of people use that as an excuse. They're like, oh, why would I read the Bible? It's so boring. It's like, maybe your reading skills is just bad, because the Bible is actually pretty hilarious with like silly things like this. And I mean, how is the Bible any more boring than a lot of other books out there that are equally as boring? I mean, you could make the argument that like every religious text is boring. You can make the argument that any text can be boring. I mean, I just made that whole spiel earlier about like how I love manga, but like, I know people that find manga very boring. Like, what do you mean manga's boring? But you can make. But my point is, you can make the argument that anything's boring, but you can also make the argument that anything can be fun to read. But you just gotta, be an open mind and find the things to laugh at. And this is one of those moments where you can find like Luke 8 has those moments where you can find and you can laugh at it, because it is kind of comical. And I think that, more power to the Bible writers for being able to laugh at themselves at silly stuff like this, and it just I think the beauty of I think the beauty of that is also like how human the Christians were and understood not just their own humanity but the humanity of God, and they're able to laugh at stuff like this, and I find it funny. I'm able to laugh with them because this is actually kind of a funny story when you once you read through the whole chapter, and you read all of chapter 8 in like one sitting like we did today, even though it took me 2 hours to exposit the whole thing. But it when you read through stuff like that, I think it adds the that salt and pepper of life. Anyway, we hit a record low. Only one chapter. No, actually, that's not true. I think back in when I started doing this, I think I had a Genesis chapter that was like one chapter for the whole stream. But I mean, to be fair, if I really, really wanted to, although I don't, I mean, like I said, like pastors do entire sermons on like less stuff. So, I mean, technically, if I was really like gonna go in each chapter gung ho to the max, I mean, you could spend like, and this is where once again, like, people think, oh, you can read the Bible to cover pretty quickly, but at the same time, like, you really want to study it, it could take you lifetimes. Because, like, for instance, with the book of Luke, if we could spend the whole year on it, I'm not going to. At least I hope not to spend the whole year on one book, but there's just so much. And yeah, I know today we only got through one chapter, so the description is wrong. Next week we'll try, though. We'll try, but no promises at this rate. I'll tell you that much. But with that being said, this is going to be the end of the stream. Just a bit of housekeeping. So next week we'll have our podcast on Monday at 4 o'clock Pacific time. Then I should be finishing Rise Eterna. I feel like I'm pretty close at the end of the game, unless it does like a whole, here's the second half of the game, crazy kind of twist. But we'll see. I should be near the end of Rise Eterna, honestly. But anyway, so we got Rise Eterna next Wednesday at 2 o'clock. We have Throwback Thursday next week with Heroes of Might and Magic 2. And the next Friday, we're going to read Chapter 9. And I'm going to tell you that's the only thing we're going to read because I don't know if we're going to get more than that covered. At this rate, a record low would be like I couldn't even finish one chapter in a whole stream. That'd be an interesting development. I hope it doesn't happen because, I plan to do Luke and Acts and Romans by the end of this year. So that's the goal now. And I don't want it to be even less than that. So, but with that said, hope you guys enjoyed today's read of Luke chapter 8. I will see you guys on Monday for the Streaming Parson podcast. But in the meantime, I hope you guys have a good Friday night, a great weekend, and I will see you for that podcast. Good night and God bless you.